If someone tells you they were born in 2002, there's a very small part of your brain that immediately goes, that's not a real adult, that's a large child with a debit card. And then you do the math, realize they are in fact an adult, and your bones quietly begin to dissolve. Because time is passing, rapidly, without permission. Now, I was born in 1996, which puts me in a very specific and extremely confusing position where I am technically a millennial, but also close enough to Gen Z to understand what they're saying, while still being emotionally damaged enough to not participate. Which means I am uniquely qualified to explain both groups incorrectly. So let's start with the basics. Millennials are generally defined as people born between 1981 and 1996. Gen Z is 1997 to around 2012. And anyone after that is either Gen Alpha or just a highly advanced iPad with legs. Now, on paper, these groups are very clearly separated. In reality, they are not, because if you put a 27-year-old and a 25-year-old next to each other, you cannot tell which one is which, unless one of them says adulting unironically. And even then, it's still not a guarantee. So instead of using age, we use behavioral cues. For example, millennials can be identified by three main traits: ankle socks, slightly receding hairlines, and a deep emotional attachment to things that no longer exist. Gen Z, on the other hand, can be identified by loose clothing, aggressively confident skincare routines, and the ability to turn any sentence into a psychological diagnosis. You didn't text back for 3 hours. That's a trauma response. And the unnerving part is they're not wrong. They just say it about everything. But the real difference is not appearance, it's behavior. Let's start with communication, because this is where things immediately fall apart. Millennials text like they're writing an email. They will send you a full paragraph with complete sentences, punctuation, and emotional context. Hey, just checking in. I was wondering if you're free later. No worries if not. Which is nice, but also slightly exhausting. There's something deeply millennial about the phrase, no worries if not. It is a complete sentence dedicated entirely to managing the other person's potential guilt about saying no. It is empathy encoded into punctuation. Gen Z, on the other hand, texts like they're dropping breadcrumbs. Message, message, message. Each one containing a fragment of a thought. Hey, are you free? Later. Lol. Never mind. Which is not inefficient, it's just distributed. And if you complain about this, they will say it's for emphasis, which is true, it's just not emphasis that anyone asks for. Now, older generations look at this and think, why don't you just send one message? And the answer is simple, because Gen Z doesn't think in paragraphs, they think in momentum. Each message is a continuation, a rhythm, a performance, which makes texting less like communication and more like improvisational theater. The skull emoji alone contains multitudes. It doesn't mean death, it means something was so funny it killed them, which is a completely logical evolution of language that somehow still takes a second to process every time. Now let's talk about attention spans, because this is where things get slightly uncomfortable. Millennials grew up in a time where the internet existed, but it wasn't everything. You had to sit down at a computer, wait for it to connect, listen to sounds that felt like you were summoning a demon, and then slowly access information. Which meant the internet was an activity. You went on it, and then you went off it. There were whole parts of the day where you were simply not online. Not because you chose to be, but because the infrastructure didn't allow it. Gen Z grew up in a time where the internet is not an activity, it is the environment. It is always on, always updating, which means their brains adapted to constant input, short videos, fast content, immediate feedback. So when you ask them to focus on one thing for a long period of time, it feels unnatural, not because they're incapable, but because the environment they grew up in never required it. The internet they inherited was already optimized, already fast, already shaped around their attention, rather than asking them to shape their attention around it. Meanwhile, millennials can technically focus longer, but only because they were trained in an era where boredom existed, where you'd sit in a waiting room with nothing but your thoughts, which is now considered a myth or a form of psychological harm, depending on who you ask. Now let's talk about humor, because this is where generational differences become completely incomprehensible. Millennial humor is structured. It has a setup, a punchline, a clear intention. It is humor that once you can understand it, it is doing the work for you. Gen Z humor is not structured. It is chaotic, absurd. Sometimes it doesn't even feel like a joke. It's just a statement that exists, and somehow it's funny. For example, a millennial joke might be, I tried to eat healthy, but then I saw pizza. Relatable, clear, understandable. You know where it started and where it ended. A Gen Z joke might be, Bro said it is what it is, and it was not, in fact, what it was. And you either understand that instantly or not at all. There's no middle ground. No explanation makes it funnier. In fact, explaining it is precisely how you kill it, which is the point. Gen Z humor functions like a handshake. Either you're in on it or you're not, and if you have to ask what's funny, you've already answered the question. Now let's talk about slang, because every generation believes the next one has ruined language, and every generation is wrong about this. Language is not being ruined, it is evolving at a rate that makes the previous generation feel old, which is, to be fair, slightly annoying. Millennials said things like on fleek, it's lit, epic win, and adulting, which at the time felt correct. In hindsight, it was not. On fleek lasted approximately 14 months before becoming the linguistic equivalent of a participation trophy. Adulting became the word every millennial used to describe basic life tasks in a way that made everyone feel exhausted. But Gen Z slang is both more efficient and more confusing, because most of it translates to the same meaning. That's good, but in different forms. Fire, gas, slaps, bussin'. It's different, which all mean the same thing, just with slightly different emotional textures. Slaps implies something hit harder than expected. Hits different implies context-dependent superiority. Bussin' implies enthusiasm so strong it required a new word entirely. And then you have phrases like let him cook, which has nothing to do with cooking, or she ate, which has nothing to do with eating, or no cap, which has nothing to do with hats. Which means the language is evolving, just not in a direction that anyone over 30 can track in real time. Now let's talk about money, because this is where the differences get a lot less funny. Millennials entered the workforce during or immediately after a financial crisis. They were told education was the path to stability. Many of them got expensive degrees, graduated into a collapsed job market, and spent the better part of a decade working their way back to the kind of financial security, which is a very specific kind of damage. It made millennials simultaneously anxious about money and resigned to the idea that traditional paths don't exactly lead where they're supposed to. Gen Z entered adulthood during a pandemic, which is different because the pandemic didn't just disrupt the economy, it disrupted the entire premise of how you were supposed to grow up. School disappeared, first jobs became remote, social milestones got delayed or skipped entirely. So now you have two generations who both understand financial instability, just through different lenses. Millennials worry because it happened to them. Gen Z worries because they watched it happen and assumed it would happen again. Which means both groups are anxious about money, they're just anxious in different registers. Now let's talk about social behavior, because this is where the contrast becomes very clear. Millennials grew up with the idea that you should go outside, meet people, and experience things directly. Gen Z grew up with the idea that you can do all of that online, which means socializing is no longer tied to physical presence. You don't need to go somewhere to interact. You just need to exist digitally. And this changes everything, because it reduces friction, but also reduces depth. Interactions become more frequent, but also more shallow. Millennials have a complicated relationship with social media because they remember before it. They have a reference point for what socializing looked like without constant documentation and performance. Gen Z doesn't have that reference point. Social media is not a layer on top of their social life. It is part of the structure of it, which is neither better nor worse than how things were before. It's just different, and it produces different results. Now let's talk about anxiety, because this is the one thing both generations have perfected. Millennials developed anxiety because they were told if they worked hard, everything would be fine. Go to school, get a job, buy a house, follow the steps. And then it wasn't fine. The steps didn't work. The promises didn't hold. So they developed a very specific kind of anxiety, which is the anxiety of someone who did everything right and still felt behind. Gen Z developed anxiety because they were told everything is uncertain, and they believed it, not cynically, but practically. They absorbed the information available to them, economic instability, climate change, political dysfunction, and concluded that planning too far ahead is probably a mistake. So now you have two generations that are equally stressed, just for slightly different reasons, and with slightly different coping mechanisms. Millennials cope with wine and irony. Gen Z copes with therapy speak and memes about dissociation. Both are valid. Neither is technically fine. Now let's talk about identity, because this is where Gen Z has clearly evolved. Millennials spent a lot of time trying to fit into existing structures, careers, lifestyles, expectations. There was a fairly clear script, and even when they deviated from it while acknowledging it existed. Gen Z spends a lot of time questioning those structures, redefining them, or ignoring them entirely, which is both impressive and slightly terrifying. Because it removes stability, but also creates flexibility. The millennial identity was largely shaped by external structures. Your job, your relationship status, your neighborhood. Gen Z identity is more self-constructed, more layered, and significantly harder to summarize at a dinner party, which is probably a good thing, but also means that Gen Z explaining themselves to anyone older than 30 requires a patience that not everyone has. Now let's talk about work ethic, because both generations get accused of not having one, usually by the generation above them. Millennials were called lazy for wanting work-life balance, for expecting their job to mean something, for not being grateful enough for the opportunity to work 60 hours a week in an open-plan office under fluorescent lighting. Gen Z gets called lazy for a completely different set of reasons. For setting boundaries, for leaving jobs that don't align with their values, for refusing to perform enthusiasm they don't feel. But here's the thing. Neither generation is lazy. They just have a different definition of what work is supposed to cost them. Millennials were the first generation to openly question whether the trade-off was worth it, whether a career that consumed everything was actually a career worth having. Gen Z skipped the questioning part and went straight to the answer, which looks like entitlement to people who spent years asking the question out loud before acting on it, but is actually just efficiency, which ironically is something the workplace has always claimed to want. Now let's talk about how both generations relate to institutions. Millennials are skeptical of institutions. Banks, governments, corporations, media. They watched those institutions fail during the financial crisis and came away with a healthy distrust that occasionally tips into cynicism. Gen Z is not skeptical of institutions in the same way. They simply do not think of them as the default structure of life. Institutions feel like one option among many, which is a subtle but important difference. Skepticism requires acknowledging the thing you're pushing back against. Gen Z often just routes around it. Now let's talk about nostalgia, because this is where millennials dominate. Millennials are deeply attached to the past. Old games, old shows, old technology, because it represents a simpler time, before everything became optimized, before every piece of content had a metric attached to it, before every interaction was potentially public. The early internet was, in retrospect, a beautiful chaos. Things were just there. You found them or you didn't. Nobody knew how many people were watching. Gen Z also experiences nostalgia, but for things that are significantly more recent, which is confusing, because they are nostalgic for things that still exist, but slightly differently. They will be nostalgic for a version of an app from 4 years ago, or an aesthetic from 2019, or a moment in internet culture that lasted 6 months, which tells you something important. When the world moves fast enough, nostalgia doesn't need a 20-year head start. It just needs a Tuesday. Now here's the important part. Despite all these differences, the core experience is the same. Both generations are trying to navigate a world that is changing faster than expected. Technology is accelerating, economies are shifting, social structures are evolving, and no one fully understands what's happening, least of all the people who are supposed to be in charge. So while it looks like generations are completely different, they are mostly responding to different environments with the same basic tools: humor, community, identity, and varying amounts of denial. Millennials adapted to the early internet. Gen Z adapted to the permanent internet. And the next generation will adapt to whatever comes next, which will probably be worse. Now here's the conclusion. Generations are not as different as they seem. They just have different reference points, different habits, different ways of coping. But the underlying experience is the same, trying to make sense of a system that keeps changing while pretending you understand it, which no one does. So the next time you see someone from a different generation doing something that makes no sense to you, just remember, it probably makes perfect sense to them. And eventually, something you do will make no sense to someone else. Which is not a problem to solve, it's just how generations work. Each one inheriting a slightly different world, adapting to it, developing their own language, humor, and anxieties around it, and then being mildly baffled by the people who come next. Which is the most human thing imaginable. Anyway, you can subscribe.